Our viewers are able to watch this thanks to technology. We didn't create most of these things ourselves. We owe it to the people who came before us and to the society working today. So, in other words, we can't be individuals by rejecting our social nature. Individuality here means the following. What are we producing with the values we have embraced? We try to make statements like, this is the one thing that never changes within a tradition, and so on. But most of these are actually reductionist approaches. If what we're talking about is something more dynamic, then what really needs to be preserved is the consistent continuation of change and transformation. In other words, it's about adapting. So, in fact, the past is also a matter of interpretation. A large part of what we call tradition, or what we want to preserve as traditional, is actually related to how the past is constructed and how it is told today.
Hello to everyone from Istanbul School. Dear viewers, today we will talk about our beliefs and values in the modern world. Our guest is Dr. Yasin Ramazan. Welcome, Professor.
Glad.
How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
Thank you very much. Thank you for being with us, Professor. Professor, we are living in the modern world, in the age of individualism, in the age of speed. How do these affect and position our beliefs and values? What do you think?
Of course, this is a question that can be answered in many ways, because when we talk about the modern era, we need to answer by considering the past 300 years. So, to say it affects us in this way and leads to that result would be a bit reductionist. But still, if we look at it from an analytical perspective, there is a perception and a discourse that the modern era is generally an age of liberation from beliefs. In fact, by making this systematic, there are some things like positivism. We see its effects in both science and politics. For example, what does this mean? Does it mean an age without belief? In other words, people who used to live by faith up until now have since moved on to knowledge. Now, we're in the age of knowledge, and so on. Of course, there's more to this narrative. This is basically a narrative about the evolutionary development of humanity. So this is very primitive. At a time when people were living with magic or myths, later on here is theistic. Religions emerged as a more advanced version of this. Then comes the belief in a single God, the belief in a single universe, and the development of an understanding of nature, and so on. From there, after humanity advances a bit more, it discovers science. And now, gradually, religious belief is said to fade away from human cognitive abilities, and belief in knowledge takes its place. At least, that's how the story goes. But this very narrative itself shows up as a problem for us, because actually, we see that the approach to knowledge itself is problematic, first of all. In other words, it's not just belief that's problematic. Since the approach to knowledge is flawed to begin with, belief also becomes problematic. So what's the mistake here? The knowledge is a category independent from belief. So, for example, there are beliefs. These are a set of thoughts that haven't quite become knowledge, and also inform. These are thoughts as well. These are the ones. Prove with evidence, confirmation, or maybe rejection, and so on. What this actually tells us is the belief that is developed based on this distinction, and the opposition between belief and knowledge, or things like belief versus life, belief versus science, all create a false. They create a dichotomy. They create a dilemma. There is always belief within knowledge. Epistemically speaking, I mean. First, you believe in something. Of course, when I say first, I don't mean a chronological order. In other words, everything we consider as knowledge is actually a kind of belief. But some beliefs are more solid than others. And we measure that solidity sometimes through certain social mechanisms. Sometimes we measure it ourselves directly. For example, right now, we have a belief about the temperature of this room. Where do we get this belief from? I mean, there's something called Celsius, a unit of measurement. We look at a temperature that we accept according to that unit, and we call that knowledge. At the same time, let's say we have a device that measures the temperature of the room. We have a thermometer. We also believe that the thermometer works. So, in fact, when it comes to everything we call knowledge, we're actually inside a kind of network of beliefs. Some of these beliefs support the others more strongly. And some of this support is organized socially. Some of it is personal. For example, let's say, did you have a dream last night? You have to believe in that too. But no one else can deny or confirm it except you. Isn't the dream you saw real? Right now, for example, of course, that's also a kind of knowledge, but it's personal knowledge. So when we think about all of this, we see that what we call knowledge actually involves belief. And what we call the age of information, that is, what we think of as the era where modernity expresses itself more fully. What we think it expresses is itself a set of beliefs. And in this sense, the modern era is also an age of belief. But it's possible to say that beliefs have changed compared to the past in this sense. So, it's not an age without belief, but rather an age where what is believed in has changed. And that's what we see here. That's the main difference.
So, belief seems more fundamental and all-encompassing. In other words, there needs to be a belief at the foundation of knowledge in order for us to call something knowledge. Maybe it's also necessary to mention this here. Professor, I mean the variability of knowledge, the variability of science. We see our beliefs as more fundamental. In other words, we might think that science, that knowledge, is sharper and clearer, that it's concrete and unchanging, separate from belief. Professor, so, this distinction here might also suggest that science overlaps with belief. What do you think about that?
Actually, both exist. For example, some people think that belief is much more unchanging. Some people think that knowledge is unchanging. But technically, scientific knowledge does not aim to produce something unchanging. In this sense, we can see how dynamic belief is in that context. For example, certain things, like what we call hypothetical thinking. What we call thought is actually a matter of belief. You have to believe in something for a certain period of time in order to conduct research, experiments, and observations, so that those beliefs can either be supported or abandoned if they're not supported. Therefore, in science that is based on hypotheses, we also need to demonstrate how a certain belief system, or the weight of beliefs, actually works. Similarly, for example, some people think that beliefs themselves don't really change, but rather that things about the world or about science change, that modernity hasn't really changed beliefs. But actually, that's not true either. Beliefs do change. I mean, a person's own beliefs can change too. Let me put it this way. If you still believe in something at age 40 that you believed in when you were 6, or if you still believe in something at age 60 that you believed in at 40, then there's a big problem. So here, the belief about the person himself is vary. Or it's a belief that isn't important. Something that doesn't affect their life. Basically, something they heard and believed as a child. So, they never needed to change it. Or there's a serious denial mechanism at play. Because if someone still believes in something at age 6, let's say belief in God, or belief in the afterlife, or judgment, let's say the things you learned about questioning at age 9. If someone still believes in those things in exactly the same way at age 40, there's a serious problem. Right here. Because the way a 40-year-old sees the world, their experiences, the way they make sense of things and interpret them, is not the same as when they were 9. First of all, there is a serious conceptual difference. In other words, when we start living in the world of concepts, like during adolescence, then going to university, or even if someone doesn't go to university, by the time they reach university age, a person starts to think with concepts and certain abstractions. After those abstractions come in, it's still at work, believes like a 9 or 10-year-old. Then that belief isn't a very significant belief. That's why, or they might be denying the problems within that belief.
So, we've made such a distinction between belief and knowledge. But we also have our traditional values, Professor. So, with everything the modern world brings, is it possible to strike a balance between these traditional values and modernity? Or how can such a balance be achieved?
Now, the phrase traditional values can sometimes lead us to think about certain things incorrectly. In this sense, I mean, when we look at it, the past is over and done with. We are living in the present. Because we are living today as a result of what has come from the past. And it seems like we'll be able to predict the future based on what we do today. Even though this is a comforting thought, it's actually a mistaken one. The past is actually also a matter of interpretation. I mean, anyone watching this program right now, if they try to talk about something from 10 years ago with a close friend, and I'm saying this as an experiment, they'll see just how differently they remember things, how differently they describe the same events. This could be something personal that happened between them, or it could be something that happened in our country, or something that was in the news. Let them talk about it and see what comes up. So, in the end, the past is also a matter of interpretation. A large part of what we call tradition, the things we want to preserve as traditional, is actually about how the past is constructed and how it's told today. And just think about it. If something from 10 years ago can change so much, imagine that as a multiplier. Now apply that to 100 years, or 300, 500 years. Apply it, then we can see just how much the things we call tradition have changed and transformed over time. We can really see it then. Let me give you a very concrete example. Today, one of our so-called traditional values is tea. Right? I mean Turkish tea. Turks have become tea drinkers. We're probably the biggest tea drinkers in the world right now. It even has its own special glass. And that tea, both among ourselves, as Turks, when we see that tea, it reminds us of our Turkish identity. And from the outside, people say, oh, that's Turkish tea. But this tea doesn't even have a 100-year history. I mean, drinking tea and it becoming a part of our culture is not something we've been doing for centuries. I mean, especially before the Republic in Turkey tea. Maybe it existed in some way, maybe in special settings or brought from outside, but most people hadn't even heard of tea. I mean, but today we're discussing a tradition that's only 50 to 60 years old. A tradition that's been growing more and more. And what is our national drink? Everyone would say tea. How does this perception come about? It happens like this. A perception forms. Once the idea that this is our traditional drink takes hold, isn't that great? We all start to embrace our tradition. This can actually be given as evidence that the past I mentioned is also a kind of construct or assumption. Actually, there are a lot of things like this. It's not just about tea, coffee, or tomatoes and such. Tomatoes are similar. No dish is without tomatoes.
Of course.
But tomatoes haven't even been around for a century here. You know what I mean? It's something like that. This is actually present in many of the ideas we've coded as traditional. I mean, from the way we dress to the way we speak, to how we perceive and evaluate things. The thing that's misunderstood here is the past. Our perception that it needs to be preserved is mistaken. And actually, that's a modern perception. If what we call the past is something that's still alive today, it has to keep changing. If it's dead, then preserve it. Like, for example, if you find an ancient theater, you try to preserve it as much as possible because you think there isn't much left of that theater today. Well, actually, there is something left, but anyway, that's not the point right now. So, what you're trying to preserve is actually somewhat dead. What if? What you call traditional values is something that's still alive today, then it has to keep changing. It changes little by little. You might not notice it right now. You might say, I live according to this tradition, and as a part of it. If you say that, you keep it alive. But tradition isn't something that just floats around and lives on its own. So, in reality, there's no conflict.
Yes, I was just about to ask a question about preservation, Professor. We always have this perception that we need to protect our past values, our traditional values, that we need to hold on to them. Otherwise, they'll just disappear. Amidst all this change and transformation, is there really something fundamental, truly genuine, lasting, and actually in need of protection?
There definitely is. I mean, this is a bit like it resembles Wittgenstein's rope. Let's imagine a rope like this. From one end to the other, a single. There's no single strand inside, but as one strand is tied to another and another, together they form a whole rope. That's kind of how I see tradition. For example, let's say the Turkish Islamic tradition, or whatever else. We try to make statements like, this is the unchanging thing within a tradition, and so on. Culturally and anthropologically, you see things like this in these studies, but most of them are actually reductionist. That's the approach. If what we want to preserve is something more alive, then it's actually the consistent continuation of change and transformation. It's about adapting. For example, let's say there's a hygiene habit that was born out of a specific need in the tradition. If you have an understanding of why this habit emerged and how it has continued, then anything that keeps that understanding alive immediately becomes a part of that tradition. So, for example, if I tie this back to tea, actually, it's soup that's more traditional for serving to guests. You serve soup, hot soup, you share your soup. So, there's something about soup. For example, I guess it's the idea of something hot there. The act of sharing something warm, of warming someone up, continues with tea. It's easier. You can drink more of it. And since it has a bit of caffeine, it's also addictive. So, we see that this transformation has taken place very successfully. Actually, it's like this with many things. It's the same with clothing, with our values, with the judgments we have about each other. But of course, there are interruptions as well. At some point, a traditional thing can no longer sustain itself. It becomes impossible to recreate or reestablish it. And at that point, it gradually has to be let go. We have to accept this as well, because, I mean, this thing we call tradition. As I just said, it's not something floating in the air, something divine that exists independently of people and affects us from afar. We are the one too. We are trying to understand it. And in this sense, actually, the definitions that modernity assumes, closed, clearly defined, and unchanging within a set framework. It does not accept some traditional definitions of quality. So not in any tradition, just ours. We simply can't find it. It's actually because these efforts don't exist that postmodernism emerges to some extent. So what you consider a boundary, almost nothing you said will fall within these limits. Does not hang. It goes beyond them. So actually, it feels like there are no boundaries, but that's misleading.
Yes, I understood it like this, Professor. Offering soup to someone, maybe a stranger or someone we know, was a way to show our warmth, our hospitality. Over time, this turned into tea. Maybe in the future, it will turn into something else. But what's fundamental there? And I keep looking for that foundation. The fundamental thing is, in the context of humanity, to establish a connection with another person, to offer something, to strengthen that bond. This can change or transform over time. It could evolve into something else. But maybe what we really need to preserve is the human relationship itself. A closeness to another person is an emotional bond.
Yes, I mean, for example, This shows that our sense of humanity is still alive, no matter who it is. You offer a glass of tea to whoever comes by. Let's say, for example, you have an adversary, you have a disagreement. If you sit down and offer a cup of tea, the atmosphere softens a bit. You start to see each other as human beings. That's something important, for this to continue.
But what we understand as modernity, this thing we call individuality, actually shows the opposite. I mean, the idea that a person should only think about themselves, that constantly repeated message to value yourself, put yourself first. It's like isolating yourself from others, like always putting yourself in the spotlight. Since this is sometimes described as something that breaks away from our traditional values, a prejudice against modernity can also develop. So maybe here, how should we talk about finding a balance?
Well, the thing is, there are some questions that people really can't answer. Or rather, there are some questions that I think simply don't have an answer. One of these is the relationship between the individual and society. That tension. I mean, I don't think there's an answer where you can say it's all about the individual or all about society. There are many people looking for this. Philosophers, sociologists, psychologists, you name it. Where is it? Whoever gives a clear-cut answer to this inevitably ends up neglecting the other side. So how can we answer this without falling into that trap? We could put it like this. Yes, there is a space that needs to be protected when it comes to individuality. And this space is constantly changing. It changes dynamically. Some societies make less room for the individual. Some societies are more individualistic. They develop a certain culture, a certain tradition. But ultimately, both sociality and individuality are part of our reality. Now, what's important here is not to try to reduce one to the other. For example, individuality, if what we call individuality, despite society, despite our need for social connection, means you are the most important, you do whatever you want. Cut out anyone who doesn't suit you, erase the other person. Don't worry about this kind of thing. Don't stress, do whatever you want. You're the best, you deserve the best. When we say things like this, a serious problem arises. A narcissistic. You begin to live with an individual understanding. However, when we look at it today, for example, we're drinking water, or we're talking here right now. There are so many technical devices here. People watching us can do so thanks to technology. We didn't make most of these things ourselves. In other words, we owe it to the people who came before us and to the society working right now. So, we can't be individuals by rejecting our social nature. Individuality here means this. What are we producing with the values we embrace? So where do we stand? Our individuality. A set of things that can express it. How boldly can we put forward behaviors and words that originate from ourselves? It's about that. Otherwise, we really start to. We start to become a burden to society. This is how a narcissistic culture develops, more or less. And in this case, the individual doesn't feel indebted to anyone. They start to feel entitled to everything. So does society owe you? Your parents owe you. Everyone is constantly indebted to you, and you feel like you deserve everything no matter what, without giving anything to society, your family, your environment, or your loved ones. But you're right about everything. This kind of a mindset starts to emerge.
So, Professor, lastly, in the context of faith and values, how should the construction or preservation of identity be approached? How do you see this?
When it comes to identity, we are very passive. First, we need to accept this. When we say let's build our identity in this way. What can we do about our value judgments? We talk about this, but the issue of identity is mostly something we accept and are largely passive about, and whichever whole a person wants to see themselves as a part of, and does see themselves as a part of. Certain behaviors related to that need to develop. You need to act according to the beliefs related to that, and those beliefs. we have to give place to it in our lives. So, the issue of identity. Today, it's very concrete things like being a citizen of a certain country or belonging to a certain race. In other words, it can create some imagined communities, but as we can observe today, the reality of these, a constantly cracking, creates a structure. So, do people who really belong to a certain race actually form an identity? Mostly no, because they don't have a shared belief system. I mean, they believe in very different things. So, when it comes to the issue of identity, the clearest thing I can say is this: whatever whole a person is going to be a part of, a behavior and belief, development will occur.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your valuable insights. We try to draw a roadmap in the context of faith and values. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Dear viewers, we talked about our beliefs and values in the modern world. Today, see you in the next episode. Goodbye.